So I'm a little disappointed because this looks beautiful. No, we're not going to talk about weddings today. Instead, we are going to really talk about some issues that come up in the conduct of research that relate to our research on those that might have impaired capacity, the very young and the very old, hence something old and something new. For those of you that don't know, many years ago, Ada Sue Selwitz drafted me to co-write the Decisional Capacity Guidelines with Bob Walker for the UK IRB. And I will say, at the time, this was really unbelievable, state-of-the-art, way ahead of the rest of the field, way ahead of the majority of organizations that I interact with across the nation and internationally. And still to this day, for those of you that don't know, our Form T, our capacity module really still is by far leap years in advance of anything that anyone else is doing out there. I do serve on a few ethics committees as well. I don't get paid for those, so they're not conflicts. And again, we're not going to talk about marriage. That's way too ethically complex for me. So our objectives today, as we already went over, are to look at populations, disease conditions that predispose to decisional capacity concerns, to look at capacity evaluation tools, and to also talk about some real-world examples and potential research strategies that each of us may adopt. And I like to do this to my study coordinators. I like to give them little quizzes on how to be a study coordinator where there is no correct answer. No matter what you pick, it's going to be a protocol deviation. And the trick is to pick the most correct answer. Now today I turn that around, and so with the case vignettes there are a series of questions and answers, and none of the answers are wrong. Some of them may be more wrong than others depending on how you think about them, but I really think that that's really the art of what we do in research. So to think about decisional capacity in these impaired populations, one really needs to think about this in a simple way. And I do a lot of capacity evaluations for guardianship, for people that are losing their ability to make their own financial or healthcare decisions. So I'm constantly involved with the court system in Kentucky. And this holds true whether it's clinical capacity or research capacity. Very, very true. There really is a foundation for capacity and making one's own decisions. And the foundation is an understanding of what the issues are. And so this is really what we're trying to get across when we consent somebody and go through those extensive consent forms. We then actually need to see that the person in front of us can evaluate that understanding and apply that evaluation to their own unique situation, and then ultimately express a choice. Now, I always get a chuckle out of that, because how many of you people in the room know somebody who is wishy-washy, who can never make a decision, who's like, yeah, well, I think we'll go with that. No, let's do this. Oh, I can't make the decision. What they've just told you is that they lack capacity. So the next time you hear that from somebody, you can just turn around and say, all right, we're going to get you a guardian overall. So each of these points are going to build on one another. And, we may have extreme examples, a newborn infant that can't even talk. Well, obviously, they're not going to understand your 26-page consent form, nor are they going to express their choice in a verbal way. But as we'll talk about, they may express their choice in other ways. And we may have folks as they age with different conditions. They may have a particular stroke, or they may have a neurologic condition that might not affect their understanding, but might affect some of these other processes. So from the Belmont report itself, and I'm a big fan of the Belmont report, there are excerpts in this specifically that deal with autonomy. And it basically states that persons with diminished autonomy are entitled to protection. This is a rule that we all have to follow. Some persons may be in need of extensive protection, even to the point where we say, you can't participate in this research study, or you can't make this decision yourself in regards to your clinical care. And yet other persons may require very little protection, and so we're always walking a tightrope. As I tell the medical students and my residents frequently, the power of being a doctor is immense. You know, the local police can pull any one of us over on the way home from work tonight and put us in jail for 24 hours, never charge us, and we have no recourse to being incarcerated for that 24-hour period. That is the law. But a doctor can turn around and take that police officer and put him behind bars for 72 hours on a hold before it even has to go to court and be settled on. So that power is immense. And when we talk about protecting people, we have to worry about the slippery slope. When do we actually cross that line? When do we actually strip rights and privileges from someone who might retain the capacity to make those decisions? So we can think about decisional impairment in many different ways, and you know, I really enjoyed helping to rewrite the decisional capacity guidelines, because prior to this exercise in 2007, it was really my research in the area of Alzheimer's that was almost exclusively picked on by the IRB for capacity issues. And now I've been able to spread that misery out amongst the university, so we all shoulder a little burden here. But we can see there could be situational versus disorder-related impairment. So this might be a busy emergency room, somebody in pain. It could be somebody presenting with a stroke. We could have global impairment or specific impairment. So global impairment, somebody in a coma, versus somebody with very specific impairment, perhaps with paranoid psychosis, that thinks that they're going to remove their organs and send them off with the aliens. It could be static. It could always be there. It could be progressive and get worse. It could be episodic and appear at times, like we might see in somebody with bipolar disorder. It could be transient, time limited, and eventually resolve. Again, acute versus persistent. And one of the things, you know, that I think all of us need to keep in the back of our minds today as we talk about some of these cases and apply some of the basic principles is the concept of universal decisional impairment. And this is the decisional impairment that we cause by therapeutic misperception, letting people believe that the research study is their clinical care and is the only way to receive help, to not adequately disclose the potential risks. And part of universal decisional impairment is our failure at times to adequately take into account our subject population and or their disease state that may alter their ability to actually provide a truly informed consent. So the issue of fluctuating capacity, to me, you know, I find this fascinating. Everybody thinks it's a static thing. I see this in patients at times. So we could take my classic patient with Alzheimer's disease. We are following a large number of folks that are normal, elderly age folks in the community, and they do fine, they're cognitively testing normal, they have full capacity, they've signed our consent forms, and then one day they show up in clinic and they're developing a little bit of a memory problem, starting to go downhill. Eventually, at some point, they may lose that capacity. This is what I see on a daily basis. What I'm working towards is this day, when I take somebody with Alzheimer's disease and no capacity and restore that. The same could be held true for somebody who might show up in the emergency department in an obtunded state, who at that point in time, maybe their blood sugar is 800 and they're in diabetic ketoacidosis, but we're going to fix that and they're going to regain their capacity afterwards. And then, of course, the most complicated would be this: the moving target. Do they have capacity today? Do they have capacity tomorrow? We never really know. So when each of us are applying and thinking about disease states in our patients, one really does need to have a broad view of this. So we might see this in patients with traumatic brain injury. We might see this in people with severe depression at any given time. There's no hope. Why should I even bother? These people are having a hard time applying concepts to themselves. Yes, I understand this is a medicine that could help, but there's no hope for me. That statement in and of itself disqualifies somebody for making that decision because they're not effectively applying the information in an evaluative way. Schizophrenia, stroke, developmental disabilities, and we'll talk about this. One of the research projects that we run currently is an NIH-funded study of adult Down syndrome. And this is kind of the double whammy. These folks are at very high risk for the development of Alzheimer's disease. By about the age of 40, all of them have a brain full of plaques and tangles. Whether or not they're having changes in their memory and thinking, some develop Alzheimer's in their 20s. So now we have somebody with developmental disability throughout all their life that's impaired capacity, and now changes on top of that. Of course, degenerative dementias, cancers with CNS involvement, late-stage Parkinson's or other neurologic disease, substance dependence, ischemic heart disease sometimes, renal failure, medical conditions that we typically don't think about, but we could imagine somebody in an acute asthmatic crisis gasping for air. Does anybody out there have asthma? Has anybody ever had an asthma attack? Let me tell you, the most frightening thing in the world is not being able to breathe. It is petrifying. And anybody who tells me in the middle of an acute asthmatic crisis that they retain capacity, I would say is fooling themselves. It is do whatever it is to help me breathe again, and that's the decision. So really, really important that it's such a large group of disorders that can affect capacity. So we do have, fortunately, some guidance. Somebody who may lack capacity because of their medical condition, or potentially even their age and their developmental stage, may still benefit, certainly benefit from clinical care, but may still benefit from engaging in research. And so we'll talk about that in vignettes, but we do have, fortunately, guidelines for the legally authorized representative. And everyone should know these guidelines for an LAR are set up by each state individually. So if you are enrolling patients from Tennessee, their LAR guidelines are not the same as what we use in Kentucky. One must look up what those LAR guidelines are. If they're from Ohio, it may be a different set. So as I always say, this is kind of like the list, right? If somebody shoots the president, who takes over? The vice president. And if they shoot the president and the vice president, the Speaker of the House. And that's as far as I can go from my younger days in US history anyway. But I can go all the way with at least the LAR because we use this in practice clinically and we use this in research. So first and foremost, if there is a judicially appointed guardian, that person is going to be able to make those decisions as long as they're listed as such within the scope of guardianship. So you could be a partial guardian or you could be a full guardian. If you're a partial guardian, frequently in the state, we have to specify exactly what the person needs their guardianship for. And the guardian cannot exercise their rights over the rights of the person for whom they provide guardianship outside. And that's a way to restrain and not allow people to just have the whole shebang unless needed. After that, it's an attorney in fact who would be named durable power of attorney. Now you talk with folks all the time in clinical practice or in research, they say, yeah, I have a power of attorney. What most people are talking about is a power of attorney for financial and legal decisions. They're not talking about a durable power of attorney. It's very, very important to look at those legal documents and find out, does this actually include health care? Because if you either clinically treat someone or research and their true LAR did not make or approve that consent and agree to that process, then you're actually in breach of human subjects protections. And again, that holds clinically or research-wise. So very, very important to make that distinction. And then it goes to the spouse of the person. Now, I always say if you're separated in a nasty separation from your wife or husband, get divorced as soon as you can. Because in the interim, even if you're separated, they can call the shots. And if you show up in the ER with sniffles, right, they're going to be like, forget it, there's no hope. Hold the plug on this. So anyway, your spouse, until you are divorced, is calling the shots. Then the adult child of the person, or the majority of the children. This is also quite complicated. You get together a room full, and my social workers at the Alzheimer's Center spend a lot of time on this, where we have divided families, who half of the family thinks we should treat mom in this way, the other half thinks we should treat in that manner. This becomes incredibly complicated and difficult, and so our role really is to educate, to try to find common ground, and again, we'll talk about that. If you have no children or a spouse, then and only then for adults will it fall on the parent. Now the opposite is true. Yeah, there's separate LAR guidelines for children where the parents would be at the top of this list, not the spouse. Obviously, a spouse would not really play a role for a child, hopefully, unless they're emancipated. And then after that, we start moving down the list to the nearest living relative, and that gets complex. Is the second cousin 3 times removed better than the first cousin 5 times removed, or the like? I don't think I've ever understood those terms. Fortunately, we seldom have to go there, but we do have this as an option. So that's kind of a brief introduction to decisional capacity. Let's move into some specific examples, and I think this is really, really important. Of course, we'll talk about something old. So these are all real cases that I've encountered. Either they've been my patients, or in the case of the child vignettes, in cases that I've encountered while on the IRB. So this is an 84-year-old gentleman. He's a retired CEO of a major company. He has some mild memory problems, and he's been diagnosed with mild Alzheimer's disease. And let me tell you, this is a man who has been in charge throughout his life. I think he pretty much ordered his teachers around in elementary school and had the principal at his beck and whim. And so he's really used to that. So this is a case from years ago when I first started here at the university, 2006. We provided his wife, who was his legally authorized representative, after determining that he lacked capacity because of his impairment in understanding the research process and the specifics of our study. So we gave his wife consent, and we provided him with our assent form, which was a beautiful assent form. It had little pictures on it, you know, and we thought it was great. Well, this guy looked at this, and he's like, my wife doesn't do legal documents, and he looked at his own, and he called it a kiddie menu. He said, I don't want the kiddie menu. Give this one to my wife. Give me the consent form. So he insisted on reading this document, which he clearly doesn't understand. He does catch on the first page to why are you being asked to participate in this research study, where it says you are being asked to participate because you have Alzheimer's. He says, I do not have Alzheimer's disease. I have some mild memory problems. I want you to strike this line from the consent form. So now we're sitting with a family where we have multiple issues going on, and we have to navigate that. And isn't this just the real world? This is my real world on a daily basis, anyway. So, let's talk about these. There are several different options. Number one, you can say, well, the patient is the patient, and he's in charge. So I'll go ahead and just cross out that section that says he is being asked to participate because he has AD. Sign and date that cross out to make sure that we have responded appropriately, and allow him to move forward and sign the consent. File this afterwards with the IRB as a protocol deviation explaining that his impairment was such that he is unaware of his Alzheimer's disease state. Now, that is a protocol deviation, but it is one way to make this gentleman certainly happy, and his wife's just saying, just do what he says, you're not going to win this one. We could have sat instead and said, no, you can't have the consent form, you need this assent form, and you must sign this if you're going to enter the study, otherwise it's no-go for the study. That's another appropriate way to handle the situation. That would not get you a protocol deviation, a protocol violation. You certainly could do that. Or you could explain the consent verbally to the subject in concise, understandable terms, assent-like terms, but use the consent form instead of the assent form, and allow him to sign the consent as an act of assent, while his wife also co-signs the form. That is another way to handle this situation. Now you may have to go back to the IRB and explain why you let somebody who lacks capacity sign the consent form. That might be considered a protocol violation or deviation, but that's another way to handle it. And lastly, you could just say, that's it. I'm having a really bad day. I got in a car accident because somebody rear-ended me for a little bit of snow on the ground this morning. You're out of here. And just boot them from the study. That's another thing that you can do. That also would not cause a protocol violation or a protocol deviation. These are all acceptable responses. So we're stuck with this on a daily basis. What do you all think? Should we do number one? Should we do number two? We've got a few out there for number two. Should we do number three? We've got a few more out there. Should we do number four? So, these guys are hardcore.
How do you know that that participant not adequately participate in the study? I mean, that is a consideration here. If he's going to act like this just in consent, how's he going to act like when he has to take a pill, or et cetera? And that, for me, would be the major consideration. What do you do to have a mind?
So this is a really valid point. When we're consenting somebody for a research study, we do have to think, we sign all the time as investigators. We have to go through this investigator responsibilities with every new study. I keep saying I'm going to wallpaper my office with my GCP certificates and my investigator trainings, right? Which might argue this exact point. If you feel that the patient is not going to be compliant with research aims, then you might not want to allow them into the study. That's certainly a very, very valid point. On the other hand, the wife and the gentleman were both fairly adamant that they wanted into this study, that they were having trouble. They were already on the full state-of-the-art medicine. So it becomes even more difficult than that, but one certainly can take that tack as well. So incredibly complicated. So I will tell you, what we did was we developed at this time a new SOP, which, by the way, we don't actually have SOPs anymore. We've changed them to guidelines because guidelines are more flexible. SOPs are rigid. and that knocks down the number of protocol deviations that you actually have or can get in your study. What we decided at that time was we would follow number 3. And it really struck me that he said kiddie menu, and I still use that term to this day, is that this is a gentleman who has been in charge all of his life. He's still cognizant enough to know that we are not treating him with the respect that he is used to receiving throughout his life. So our guideline states, and we followed this policy ever since then, that we will not use assent forms, that we will use consent forms and explain to the research subject in assent style, concise language, the meat and bones of the study. We will have the LAR fully review the consent form, and then we have both sign it. One as an act of consent, one as an act of assent. Now that that is in our guidelines, we put that in all of our Form Ts that we submit to the IRB, and it's no longer a protocol deviation or a violation. It hasn't been since that original patient at that time. So that was our way of handling it, but there is no right or wrong. So here we'll move on with this case. So we assent him, his wife provides full consent, we start study procedures, everything goes well, we randomize him to study medication. They come in for a 2-week follow-up visit, and you find he's already gone through 3 weeks of drugs. So this gets to your point. She guessed it, this guy's problematic, he's still in control. His wife says, he just will not let me manage his medicines. He insists that he's doing it correctly, and when we quizzed him, he says, no, I'm doing this exactly correctly. I'm taking, you must have not, if you think there are pills missing, you must have not have given me the full amount when I left the office. It's all your fault. So now we're left, with what we do with this gentleman, and we can think about a few different things that we can do. So one would be, we could tell him that the protocol requires his wife to control the medicines, and we could provide written instructions as a reminder. So I do this frequently with folks that shouldn't be driving. I write on my prescription pad, you may not drive your car. You have Alzheimer's disease. We will reevaluate in 3 months when you return to visit, and I give them that to take home. And then the wife puts it on the refrigerator, or your wife must oversee the study medications, it's part of the protocol, or we're going to kick you out of the study. Number 2, we could give them a second chance, say, all right, I'm not really sure that we checked the pills. Maybe Steve Sitzler was napping in the investigational pharmacy, and this is just a mistake that was made. Let's give him a second chance. We report the overdosage to the IRB as a protocol deviation. On his word that it doesn't happen again, refill his pill box and send him home. Could do that. We could say, that's it. You now have crossed the line. We try to work with you in the consent process, but you are way over the top here. You're out. And kick him out over he and his wife's objections. Or we could say, we're not going to kick you out of the study, but we're not giving you any more medicine. We're going to follow you per protocol in accordance with pre-specified procedures and keep you in the research study. So all 4 of those are options for any one of us as investigators at the time. So tell me, who might think about number 1? We've got a few out there. Who might think about number 2? So it happens at times. So who might think about number 3? Nobody's getting more hardcore. And how about number 4? So we've got a lot for number 4. This is a tricky situation for this gentleman. We opted to follow number 1 and to see if we could do this. And part of it was for the research study to continue, but part of it was we also knew that this was an obstacle we had to overcome in this gentleman's life. We looked at the risk of what his overdose of medication. Fortunately, it was a very safe herbal supplement, an omega-3 fatty acid, a derivative of fish oil, and we knew that, yeah, he OD'd on it, but we weren't going to kill him by giving him a second chance. He might have a little bit of diarrhea and some extra belching. If he ODs it again on that fish oil, that he'd be okay. And it worked, actually, for this gentleman. His wife was able to not only take over the research medications, but all of his medications at home that he was incorrectly using, and it turned out to be very positive. Could that have backfired with more dangerous medication? Absolutely, absolutely. So one needs to think about that. Now, aren't these triplets cute? Something old, something new. So, children under the age of 18, and this doesn't account for emancipated children. So we do have some children out there that, as they hit their later teens, may file for emancipation, and they, in essence, get a court order that states that they become their own guardian, even though they're still a child. Now, what does the court require to do that? The court requires a capacity evaluation of those children to make sure that they actually have capacity. And for those of us with children, we know they all mature at their own rate. I think, I have 3 girls and 1 boy. I think the girls mature a little bit faster than the boys, but that's just my bias anyway. But some may really have pretty good capacity by the time they're 16. I actually moved out of my parents' house when I was 17 and got my first apartment on my own. So this can certainly happen. Now, in research, we have different levels of criteria for who is going to call the shots, depending as well on the risk of the study. So when you all put in a research protocol to the IRB on children, we're going to look at that. What is the risk of the study? If it's a minimal risk study, we just want a blood draw or something else, then one parent may be able to sign off on it. But anything greater than minimal risk requires a 2-parent sign off. And this is quite problematic sometimes, especially with the fractured family structure that we see in many areas of Kentucky, and even right here in Lexington for some. We also run into trouble because now all of a sudden we may be in a situation where we can't even verbally assent, right? We may have pre-language toddlers or babies, or those with learning disabilities. So now we're solely at the mercy of the legally authorized representative. Now, fortunately, we can use nonverbal assent-dissent processes. And I actually think about that because I think the majority of care that I provided to all 4 of my children was never really welcomed. I think they dissented when I changed their diaper. They dissented when I put them to bed. They dissented just about everything. So this is not my daughter, by the way, but I loved her facial expression. So let's talk about these. So this is case number 2. 2-year-old female, nonverbal, suffers from a lethal congenital disorder that has no available treatment or cure. So there's nothing that we can do for this child. She's in developmental regression. We know that she's going to pass away in the next few years from this neuronal storage disease. There's a scientific breakthrough. A new medicine is found that appears to be extremely promising as a cure. The phase 1 and early phase 2 studies are showing that this is making a real difference and has the potential to even save these children's lives. Not enough information for the FDA to supersede and give us a compassionate use clause, but enough that the family's really looking for this. So this is greater than minimal risk. It's an experimental medicine. So both parents should sign. So mom was the one who brought her daughter in and wants her on this new medicine. Now, dad, who's actually not even playing a role in raising this child, has to be contacted. When he's contacted, he says, not on your life is my child going into a clinical trial. Nobody's using my daughter as a guinea pig. So it's a real world case. So there's a few things that one could do. You could step on his head with those shoes, I guess, and see if he'll change his mind. So we wouldn't do that, but one could try to convince dad, to educate him, to work with the wife, to hopefully, ultimately influence his decision. Now, on the one hand, that's part of the consent process. We need to educate him because obviously he does not have an understanding of what research is. We know that nobody's a guinea pig in research overall. On the other hand, if we push too hard where we're actually influencing and changing someone's decision, now we've stepped over the line into a universal capacity issue where we've actually removed that, the ability to choose. We could just screen fail the child and say, we're so sorry, but according to human subject protection rules, we could not enroll this child, and therefore we're not going to be able to provide this medication. Or 3, we could go back to the IRB and to the ethics board here at the university to try to supersede dad's reluctance to allow his child access to the study. Dad does not want to listen, he does not want to be educated on the medicine, does not want to be educated on the research protocol. So let's just quiz the group out there. Who wants to step on dad's head with that big old heel? Number 1, try to educate and convince dad that this is in his child's best interest. So we have some folks out there willing to put in some time. Who wants to just screen fail the child? This is an obstacle that we just cannot push for. Nobody. You guys have great ethics. I think you have great ethics anyway. Or number 3, go back to the IRB, utilize some of the tools and resources that we have here to see if there is a way around this. This actually is what was chosen by the investigators, and it's not an easy decision to make. The decision had to be made on the basis of a capacity evaluation of dad. When dad was asked about the study and certain key questions about engagement of research and could express no understanding, the decision could then be made that one of the 2 parents lacked capacity, and therefore within human subjects guidelines, a single parent could sign off on the study. The same would be if you were a single parent who the other parent had passed away. For all intents and purposes, a single parent would be allowed to consent. So complex. I still wanted to step on his head. Was my general thought anyway, but I don't have heels like that, so it might not have the same impact. So case number 2, you gain all appropriate consent to enroll the child. Everything looks good. They need a monthly injection. Turns out to be painful, but not harmful, possibly beneficial. So the child comes in on their second visit, even though they've got some developmental delay, boy, they remember you. You're coming towards them with that needle, right? And that child is sticking its head into mom's, little arm, kicking and screaming, "Get away from me." That is about as clear a dissent as I have ever seen in my life. Get away from me with that needle. So you do have a few options. Number 1, you could say, this kid has no capacity. Have mom hold the child down. You just hold him down. When I give it to him quick, boom, and give him their injection. You could try to bribe them with a lollipop and toys and try to convince them to get the injection. Or you could just say, forget it. I cannot, this kid's screaming and crying, I cannot stick them with the needle when they don't want this. 3 options here. Who votes for number 1? Everybody out there? Hold them down and give them harsh parents. How about number 2? Bribe with a lollipop and toys. We got a lot of bribers out there. And number 3, withdraw the child from the study. This is just too much for them. It's reasonable. This is a reasonable way to go. They're all reasonable ways to go. I'm not sure how this situation was handled. This is the one situation that I put in there because I think about this sometimes with my Alzheimer patients. I don't bribe my Alzheimer patients if they are getting an injection and they decide they don't want an injection, or if they decide that the IV is too painful. I mean, we've even thrown people out of the study because the nurses at the CCTS are going, we can't torture this person anymore. And then we try to find them a pill study as well. So I think about this all the time. Now, case number 3, another conduct study in research. Very, very important. This is somebody in our adult Down syndrome study, 34-year-old, and the study requires an MRI scan. MRI is actually the primary outcome measure in the study. Concept asset obtained. His cognitive testing shows an IQ in the range of a 3rd grade child. So certainly his parents have been caring for him and they're his guardian. We bring him in to see the MRI machine. He's gung-ho, to help out, and having a grand old time here at the university, wearing his UK blue and everything else. Takes one look at that MRI machine, and freaks out. And now we're left with a research participant who potentially had desire to engage in the study, but had a freak out period. So we had several options. Number 1, we could just say, all right, you're not gonna do the MRI, let's just take you out of the study. We could say, well, we're gonna do everything except for the MRI, even though it's the primary study outcome measure, we'll still garner some valuable information. We could try candy and toys again, promises and bribes. 4, we could let them get familiar with the environment. Now, unfortunately, they won't let you play around with the MRI scan like a gymnasium set. But for those of you that don't know, the MRISC actually is a mock MRI scanner. And they can just play in there all day long until they get comfortable with it. So 4 options here for us. Who votes for number 1? Nobody? How about number 2? Reasonable option. Number 3, worked last time. Number 4. So again, I think, one of the things, that we often don't think about is, these research sorts of problems we're going to encounter on a daily basis. There are facilities and opportunities that we have here. You would not have that in private practice. There's no private practice out there that's going to let you use an MRI, even a mock scanner, as a gymnasium for a while. This young gentleman hung out for about an hour and a half, climbing in and out of the hole, checking the whole thing out. And then when he realized it didn't work, he said, I want to do the real one. Popped him in the scanner, got our research done, happy as a clam. He's been getting annual MRI scans ever since. That's about 5 years out now. So something old, something new, something borrowed. So this is our Form T, our capacity model, and it's really modeled off, obviously, a 3-dimensional cube where you're looking at research risk, right? So we've seen this in the instance of the child, where if it's minimal risk, maybe only one parent needs to consent. That's a little bit lighter. If it's high risk, both need to consent. What's the risk of the patient? The risk for impairment, and that may not just be the patient's age or the patient's condition. It may also be the complexity of the protocol. So I laughed, I was in a meeting the other day and somebody was talking about how complex a 12-page consent form was, and I just chuckled at them. I got some 32 pagers, and that's just the primary consent. There are 6 sub-study consents that go with it. It's a stack like this. And I don't think I understand the consent forms. I probably should stop that study, shouldn't I? And then, of course, this risk for capacity change over time. So we look at this, and this is very easy. For those of you that haven't filled out, I'm shocked on the IRB, how many people don't want to fill out Form T? Actually, if you fill out Form T, and it turns out you're not enrolling anybody with impaired capacity, you just end the form checking the box that says, we're not enrolling anybody with impaired consent capacity, and you're done. But you've checked the boxes and you've done due diligence. So what's the risk level of the study? And I won't get into that, but I always do chuckle about this. We have to do the CCSRS on everybody. This is a suicidality rating scale at every single visit for every single study. My patients, after their 4th visit are like, and you ask them, have you thought about killing yourself? They say, if you ask me that question one more time, I'm going to kill myself. So may cause suicide, may not cause suicide. Second dimension, the risk of impaired consent capacity. And the third dimension, the risk for changes. You click a button for each of these, and then what it spits out is what you should do, what the IRB recommendations are. And this was really designed to be a one-stop shop. So frequently, minimal risk studies get what I call the blow-off. That's your gut feeling interacting with the person you're consenting. Yeah, they got it. A low level would be perhaps a note jotted in their chart that says, yes, I feel that they understand, that they could evaluate, that they could apply to self, and they made the choice to continue. A moderate level might be a simple structured assessment, and an intense level would be formal structured interview or a capacity team. So this really is one of those things, and yes, our setup is built in. There are physicians and social workers. We do guardianship for the state all the time. We have tons of time to do this, but it's easier really, and our coordinators are the ones working with people. We just use the UBAC in everything that we do. So I'm going to tell you guys about the UBAC because this is borrowed. The B in UBAC doesn't stand for borrowed anyway, but this is a series of questions. Has anybody out there used the UBAC in their research? This is really a formal teach-back method, and the IRB favors the teach-back method for consent. You review the consent, and then afterwards you simply ask these questions, and your questions can be modified for your individual study. And you typically will pre-specify what you'd like for responses. What's the purpose of the study? Why do you want to participate? Now, they don't have to recite your whole 32-page consent form, but they've got to give you a general inkling in these questions that they understand. Is it primarily research or treatment? Do you have to be in the study? If you withdraw from the study, what's going to happen? If you participate, what are some of the things you'll be asked to do? What are some of the risks, discomforts, benefits? Who may pay for your risk to medical care? And so each of these items is scored individually. And if folks score very poorly on the UBAC and can't answer some of those questions, then you might really want to consider about what you want to do. But your documentation, this takes our coordinators just a couple minutes, 3 to 5 minutes as part of the consent process. And this is the ROC curve, the receiver operated curve, for how well the UBAC does against the gold standard of capacity. And let me tell you, it's unbelievable. The area under the curve here is about 97%. You'll never see a ROC curve like this. For something that takes 3 to 5 minutes, anyone can do. Any of your coordinators, research assistants, they don't even have to be a coordinator, can get that kind of level. So we'll finish up with something blue. I didn't really have anything blue or sad to talk about today. I just said, go UK, right? stop there. I'm delighted that you all had me in today, and I'm happy with it. We have 5 minutes for anyone who might have questions, comments, issues with your own study, other resources that I have not brought up or raised today in regards to what we all do on a regular basis. Linda?
I just had a quick comment question on the Down syndrome patient. Would another option be that you could pre-medicate the patient? And how do you feel about that? And what do you think about that?
So, so the question is with the Down syndrome patient pre-medication. And yes, indeed, Linda, we actually applied when we started having trouble with a lot of these kids. And we actually had families coming to us saying, you know, when they had an MRI in the past for clinical purposes, the doctor gave them a little bit of Ativan and they were able to do it just fine. So actually we did modify our IRB. For this young gentleman, we never had to use pre-medication. All we had to do was let him play around in the jungle gym for a little while. But for some of our others, and then it's really looking at that, you know, what was the risk of that versus the potential benefit to the research. So our IRB is awesome here. We don't even know, unless you've been at another university and dealt with their IRB, how good our IRB is, how much it really wants your research to be successful and to advance healthcare and discovery. To me, I'm always impressed by that. Anything else? What?
Any of the studies that you did that required a assent from a child, did you have the option to bypass the assent and request that you did not have to have a child's assent?
So you can bypass an assent if there's reason for it. So a nonverbal child has a hard time assenting unless you're going to start using behaviors, which are sometimes tricky as well. As long as, you know, so sitting in the IRB reviewing these on a regular basis, yes, indeed, we approve projects all the time that lack an assent if there is a justifiable reason for not providing an assent in that study. The same way that we got out of providing assents in our studies by just performing an assent process using the consent instead. So frequently, this is just a waiver of consent process, right? That any one of us could fill out and say, well, I'm still going to consent an assent. I'm just going to do it in a non-traditional way because that fits my population and my research best. So, great question, though. Fantastic. I'll let you all get back to work. Thank you so much for coming.